All right, man, welcome back to the God-Centered Men's Recovery Show. I'm your host, Tim Holloway, and I'm glad to be back at you again. Hey, look, if you're new here, this is a show for Christian men inside of recovery to live an awesome spirit-filled life. If that is you, welcome. So we're going to continue on our topic. I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap, but we are in the third episode about weathering the storms. And so the recap is this, is that last episode we talked about leaving Egypt. And Egypt is always symbolic of something. And it's the world with the world systems. It's leaving oppression and it's leaving slavery. Now, there's nothing more symbolic to slavery than addiction. Addiction is giving into the impulses and the desires of the sinful nature and feeling like you are governed and controlled by those influences. And that is definitely slavery in its finest form. The second thing Egypt is symbolic of is the world, and that is the world in all of its systems, that is religion, politics, and all of these different world systems that are connected to the world. And so leaving Egypt is leaving out of those systems and saying, you know what, I'm not going to put my trust and hope inside of systems, whether they be religion or politics, education, etc. I'm not going to put my hope inside of these systems that they're somehow going to fix humanity. And this is the ultimate delusion that somehow politics is going to fix humanity, that somehow education, if we could just educate people enough, this will fix humanity, or if we could just get them religious enough, this will fix humanity. And the reality is all of that is a farce. All of that is not true. So, leaving the false refuge, and that is the places where we think that we have security, the things that we think that gives us hope, and we're placing our confidence and our trust inside of those things, and that these things are going to make us better. Oftentimes we do this within the financial systems of the world, and we say, if I make enough money, if I make this amount of money, then I'm going to be comfortable, then I'm going to feel secure, and then I'm going to somehow be keeping up with the Joneses, and I'm going to be okay with myself. And all of that is just crazy. So number 4 is comfort. And that is, inside of Egypt, there was a sense of comfort inside of the world systems and the structure that was taking place. There was normality. There was routine. I had my place. I had a job. I had certain conditions. Some of my needs were met. And all of that, inside of that, is a sense of comfort and security. And lastly was predictability. There is predictability with structure. There is predictability with oppression and slavery. We know exactly how it's going to play out, what I'm going to get paid, what I'm going to build, what work I'm going to do that day, and all that different stuff. So when we think about leaving Egypt and the world system, all of those things come into play. So we're reading from Luke 8:22, and I'm going to read the first verse there. So it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said unto them, let us cross over to the other side of the lake. And they launched out. So what happened before this boat ride? That's what I want to get into. Because before the storm ever came to pass, there were certain things that began to happen inside of their lives before the storm ever began to take place. And so we're going to look at that a little bit, and we're going to see the amazing things that were happening before the storm. So I'm going to paraphrase in a lot of these, but you're going to kind of see a mental picture of what was taking place before they got into the boat that day. And that is, someone was knocking on death's door, and they got healed. And that is, there was someone who was very close to death, and they think that all hope is over and that they're going to die, and then all of a sudden they experience a healing. They rise up and begin to experience a new life. That happened right before they went into this dark period of getting into the boat. Someone was resurrected from the dead. And that is, there was someone who was already clinically dead, who was dead, and that they were resurrected and came back to life before they got into the boat. All this is going to make sense in a minute. There was a blind person who received their sight, and that is not only in an analogy of receiving sight, but literally, there was a blind person whose eyes were opened and they received their sight. The Bible says in the chapter prior to this that the people were cured from their plagues and from their diseases. And lastly, there was loose women. They may have been considered prostitutes. Who knows? But they had a lot of sin that they had committed, and they had this reputation of being sinners. And those kind of women were being set free, delivered, forgiven, and experienced this new life. So these are the situations and the things that are taking place before they got on the boat. And I wanted to thoroughly point these things out because there's a lot of things in our life that leave us on an emotional high. And that is that they're great and awesome things that begin to transpire and that begin to happen. And we begin to get elated with all of these different feelings. We begin to think of how awesome this is that I'm experiencing this. Think about this for a moment. If the day prior to this storm, you were experiencing someone who was knocking on death's door and they were healed, and you've seen someone who was dead resurrected from the dead, and you've seen a person whose blind eyes just opened and they received their sight for the first time. And people were healed of all manner of diseases, and loose women were forgiven and set free, and their mindset changed. What kind of feelings might you have during this season? Elated, right? Talk about things going well. Talk about like everything going as you imagine and experiencing all these elated feelings for experiencing all these different things that are taking place inside of their lives. They were happy for it, right? Because they were experiencing all these good things. But the reality is that the darkness was just around the corner. And that is, though they were up here, which I would call cloud 9, where everything is bopping along and everything seems smooth, everything is going happy, peachy keen, right? And then all of a sudden, they got into the boat. And I want to thoroughly point out here the emotions that were probably taking place up here was, whoo, I'm just feeling good. I'm on cloud 9. Yes, I'm rocking this. And what this takes place, inside of our life is that when we got everything together, we get quite excited. And we get a little skip in our step and a little pep to our talk and all of these different things because everything is going well. We are on a mountaintop experience and we are elated by what we are experiencing. Everything feels good and everything is fine. Well, I can tell you that this is never the test of the measure of the man, and this is never the reality of whether we have learned the lessons or not, okay? The reality comes inside of the storm. So these men who are once filled with elated emotions are now in a very situation that is described as peril. It's described as a disaster. It's described as something that is causes them to be governed by fear, and they begin to get scared about the things that are beginning to take place inside of their lives. So what I want you to see here is elated feelings of security, of comfort. On the mountaintop, everything's going well, and then they go into a storm where everything is not so well, and now there is discouragement, and now there is difficulty. But notice this, is that they're probably up on the high during the mountaintop, and they're woo, woo, just, all this stuff, and then when they get to the bottom, they're like, And so what this tells me is that their very core of their identity is attached to their experiences. And that is when things are going well, they could be very happy and elated about those things that are going well. And when things are going bad, they can be very depressed and governed and discouraged by fear. And that is whatever is happening on the outside world is what is happening inside of them. And what I want to thoroughly point out here is that happiness, according to the world and the world system, depends on what's happening to you. And that is that you can be happy, or you should be happy, because all these good things are happening to you. And the world also teaches you that if you're in darkness, if you're in a period of loss, of suffering, of the pullback that I talked about in the last episode, that you should be discouraged and you should be depressed. But I'm going to offer you a different mindset and a different belief that we can maintain composure whether we're elated, or we can maintain composure or whether we're on the pullback part of life. And that is, we shouldn't get too excited about the mountaintop, and we shouldn't get too depressed about the valleys. We shouldn't get too depressed in the storm. If we begin to understand that life is a series of ups and downs, and we thoroughly expect to rise and we thoroughly expect to drop, and knowing that life is pretty much like that pattern, then I'm not going to get thoroughly elated when I'm on the mountaintop. And I'm not going to get thoroughly disgusted, agitated, and all of these things when I'm experiencing negativity. Because I know and I understand that life is all about balance, and I shouldn't go to the extreme of elation, and I shouldn't go to the extreme of deflation. Okay? And so it's important to understand that stability is all about stability of the mind. No matter which condition you are, whether you're on the rise or you're on the fall, no matter which situation that you are facing, in here, you're not rising and you're not falling. What men often do is when they go to the mountaintop, they're elated with pride, right? They begin to walk with pride and how cocky and how everything is working out for them and how everything they touch turn to gold and success follows them wherever they go, right? And then all of a sudden, what begins to happen? They begin to get elated in their pride and their own self-conceit. And the only thing that really can and should happen is for a fall to come so it can bring them back to level and reality. And we don't want to be experiencing that over and over again if we don't need to, right? So it's important during the mountaintop to say, you know what, I'm not going to be filled and elated with pride, because that is only going to bring back the pullback. That is only going to bring back the fall. And the same thing as though men are in the pit and they're experiencing the pullback and they're saying, you know what, I'm just depressed. I just hate my life. Nothing's working out. And we begin to get filled with all this negativity that keeps us stuck inside of the pullback and we never rise. Both are equally dangerous. So the mindset is this, is that I'm going to know and understand the different areas of life, and I'm not going to be elated with pride, and I'm not going to be deflated with self-pity and victimhood. Super important. So I want to thoroughly point out what happened after the storm also, because this is thoroughly important. So they came from this mountaintop experience, and they went into the storm. And when they came out of the storm, as I read the following chapters, a couple powerful things happened that I really want to begin to note. And that is, there was a demonized man. That is a man who was governed by demons, who was controlled and was governed by fear inside of his life. Running around naked, talking to himself and doing stupid stuff, right? And he was restored completely in health. And Jesus heals somebody's daughter, okay? So coming out of the storm, this demonized man gets cured and he's walking in holistic health and he's of sound mind and he's of sound body. He's got clothes on. Someone's daughter gets healed. Some little girl gets raised from the dead. And then something amazing begins to happen, is that after the storm, after coming from the mountaintop and then going down to the pit and then coming back up, they thoroughly have been weathered. The disciples have been weathered. That means they have been battle-born. And that means that they have been tested. They went through a period of storms, if you will, and they've come out to the other side. And what begins to happen is Jesus begins to send out his disciples, right? It's almost like this, that you have learned the lesson. You have understand the storms of life, and there seems to be a something about graduation and really coming to the place of maturity that they can be sent out. Because here's the reality: when Jesus first met them, they couldn't be sent out. Okay? And so there was quite a few lessons that they had to be taught to be able to be empowered and trusted to be sent out and to give the message. And one of those things is that they had to be willing to undergo the storm and learn the lessons inside of dark times, not only in mountaintop experiences. They had to learn that no matter what takes place, I am going to be stable and I am going to be strong. And so here they were. They were sent out after the storm. Now, I thoroughly believe that the storm was the triggering event that allowed these other things to begin to take place. And the reality is that those things would not have happened if they didn't go through the storm. That's just truth. If all of them would have died in the boat that day, there would have been no demonized man restored. There would have been no daughter healed and restored. There would have been no resurrection life. There wouldn't be no sent out to the disciples because there would have been no disciples. You understand what I'm saying? And so the very storm is what catapulted them into the future. But the reality is this, is that it always comes back to what the enemy has meant for evil, God has turned around for good. And that is, you can guarantee that there's enemy's attention that day, his intentions were for destruction. And that he has come to kill, steal, and destroy. And he looked at their lives and looked at what they were accomplishing. He said, I want to put an end to this and I want to stop this. I want to kill, steal, and destroy. And this is the mode of operation of your enemy. The enemy wants to stop life and bring death. There's nothing mysterious about his intentions. Stop life, bring death. Okay? And so we see the abundance of life beginning to manifest. And he said, you know what, I'm going to put a stop to this. And they're going to get into a boat and some disastrous events are going to begin to take place. And I'm going to try to take their life. And so it is with Moses. Moses was going to be the leader that led Israel out of slavery and oppression. And during that time, they get a sense, the nation of Egypt get a sense of an uprising. And they get the inclination that something is going to begin to take place. So what did they do? They begin to murder all the children that were giving birth that year. And so as they can begin to try to stamp out what God is doing, because he was going to raise someone up to be a great leader of those people. And of course, Moses' mother knew about this. She sent them in the river in reeds, and Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, and she kept him as her own. And it just happened to be Moses was the one who was called to be a deliverer, and he was the one that was spared that day. You get this? And so the darkness, the enemy comes and tries to destroy that which is good, tries to destroy life because of the potential of what can begin to take place. Now look at your own life and say this, you know what, there's so much potential. What God could do through you is just, I don't think we can begin to fathom how the capacity and the potential energy that we all have within inside of our lives. And the potential is just through the roof, and it's great. But for that potential to become a reality, we have to go through the dark times. Okay? And we can't allow the darkness to destroy us, to get us into a pit of self-pity and victimhood, because if that takes place, then the storm has won. And what that means is that the storm has gotten inside of us now. And now the storm has caused us to walk in fear. And therefore, every potential that is going to take place is not going to happen. Because here's the worst sin in the world. We think of, oh man, the worst sin in the world is adultery, or it's murder, or it's this, that, and the other thing. But the reality is that the worst sin in the world is fear. And fear is what governs all those behaviors to begin with. Now, the root of all these behaviors that we hate, or we say, man, these are the worst sins of the world, before those ever take place was the root of fear. And this is the purpose and the intention of storms in your lives, to get you to operate inside of fear and not faith. And once we begin to operate in insecurities and fears, we begin to go down to the pit, and all of these nasty behaviors begin to manifest. And so it's important to understand what the battle is. It's between fear and faith. And are we going to allow the darkness to push us into fear? So this potential, all of these things will not happen if we succumb to fear and allow fear to influence and control us inside of the storm. Okay? Think about this for a moment. That it was the Spirit that led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted. And so the Spirit of God allowed Jesus to go into this dark moment. He allowed it to take place. Not only that, the Bible says that he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And so as we begin to examine that, we begin to understand that the darkness that takes place inside of our life is permitted by the hand of God. Now, he may not be the one that causes it, but he is the one that allows it. And that is, there is something good, there is a lesson, there is something there for us to know and to understand. And that's really important to know. But after Jesus was in the wilderness, he returned in the power of the Spirit. This is not a coincidence, okay? The returning in the power of the Spirit is correlated to the wilderness experience. Jesus would not have returned in the power of the Spirit if he didn't face his demons. Jesus wouldn't have returned in the power of the Spirit if he didn't face the temptation that was dwelling within his soul. Jesus was in all points tempted just like we are, yet without sin. And so he was tempted. He was tempted with food. He was tempted with power. And he was tempted with religiosity. Okay. All of those three things. And the reason why he was able to return in the power of the Spirit is because he was willing to go to the wilderness and overcome that experience. In other words, that very dark moment was the moment of preparation. And that there was something great for God to do in his life, and he was going to come through it, and he was going to return in the power of the Spirit. And the preparation was the 40 days and the 40 nights in the wilderness, undergoing temptation and the dark night of the soul. And that's what thoroughly equipped him with the power going through those moments. And so it's important to understand that, because we want to avoid the darkness. We want to avoid the pain. We don't want to be stretched. We don't want any resistance. Not knowing all of that stuff is all preparation. Now, Jesus, of course, spent 30 years of his life in preparation for 3 years of ministry. You put that into correlation. How much of his life was in preparation? 30 years. Okay. And then what is 3 years? That is 10%. So that is 90% preparation and 10% application. And knowing and understand that will bring us a lot of relief, because we get the lesson. And that is that most of what we go through is to prepare us for where we are going. Everything that we go through is to develop our character so we can sustain where we are going. Moses spent, from what I know of, 80 years in preparation. I believe that he spent 40 years. It could be 40 to 60. I'm forgetting my math. But 40 years in Egypt, 40 to 60. He spent 40 to 60 years inside of the wilderness, and he spent 40 to 60 years as a leader of God's people, right? I believe it's 40. So 40, 40, 40. And so what that means is that he spent 80 years in preparation, going through darkness, going through dark moments, right? Going through moments that weren't particularly very eventful or very fun. It was just plain normality. But during these times was the structure of his character, so he could begin to stand in the leadership role that he was meant to stand in. So you see that. Preparation. The wilderness is the preparation. The storm is the preparation. And that is that there was no promised land without the wilderness. The wilderness is what gave Israel the grit to face the giants. Here's what I believe, and I think it's probably pretty close to reality. If they would have escaped Egypt and went directly to war, that they would have been conquered, overcome, and destroyed because they didn't have the right mindset. In fact, I believe the Bible plays that out, that God could have very well led them another direction, but they would have faced immediate battle, and therefore they would have been consumed. And so he led them to the way of the wilderness to build their character and shape who they are so they can actually be a giant slayer, okay? So they can actually face their difficulties and rise. Because the reality is that they didn't have it in them at the time. And I can guarantee you this is the same thing that's going on the disciples in the storm. And I could see it because in the storm, they begin to fall apart. And that is, there were certain things that they needed to understand, that they need to get through to their hearts and their heads about God and about who He is, so they can begin to triumph victoriously in the future. So going through the wilderness, the storms, is a preparation to face the giants. So Jesus in this experience, he's facing his temptations. He's facing the demons, if you will. And he's experiencing thirst and hunger. He hadn't ate and drink for 30 days and 30 nights. He's experiencing hunger. So the temptation comes for him to use God's ability to supply his needs and to provide himself food, right? He resists this temptation. The devil takes him up on a large mountain. He says, all this will I give you if you fall down and you worship me. Okay? And what that means is that if you bow down to me, if you bow down and you pledge your allegiance to me and my mindset, my rule, my world system, my structure, if you bow down to that and worship me, I'll give you all this. And so he faces the temptation of power and authority. And then lastly, he said, takes him up on a high pinnacle and he says, throw yourself down from here. And Jesus said, thou shalt not tempt the Lord your God. So in every way and facet, he was tempted with the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. In every way, he conquered, overcome, and destroyed them. Okay? And what he learned also was to be content in whatever state he was in. Now, in that condition, what he was in right now, he was in hunger. And so there came an opportunity that you can sin and take away your hunger. Go ahead and do it. And he says no. So he was content in the state that he was in. And that is, he was okay with being hungry. He was okay being without. He was okay being in the wilderness, and he was okay being in the storm. That whether I'm on the mountaintop, I'm okay. And whether I'm in the valley in the storm, I'm okay. I'm okay where I am. I think it's important to understand that, because as we begin to lust and desire and all of these hungers begin to take place inside of our lives, we get discontented and frustrated, and we desire to be out of the very situation that we're in, not understanding that situation is what is going to catapult us into something bigger and better. But we try to get out of it. So here he is. He's not, we know that he's going to be the king, right? Now, Jesus is going to be the king. He's going to rule and reign. He's going to set up shop, and his kingdom is going to come on this earth, and we are going to rule and reign with him. That is all going to take place. But at that moment, that was not a reality for Jesus. Right now, at that moment, Jesus was in the wilderness. He was in a storm. He was in darkness. Okay? And basically what he was saying is that I can give you the easy path. I know God's path is through the pain of suffering and being a leader and birthing new life and a new citizenship in the kingdom and all that stuff. But all that comes through the shedding of your blood. And it comes through your own death. I'll give you the kingdoms. And all you got to do is bow. Forget the cross. Forget that way. Forget the path of suffering. Forget the path of figuring out. If you just bow down, here's the easy way. And so that is just still a major reality that takes place inside of our life. So, he came back in the power of the Spirit is because he faced his demons. And these disciples, they went through the darkness, they went through the storm, and what began to happen? They began to get delegated authority. That after the storm, Jesus said, you know what? Now it's time for you to take that message and do what I'm doing. In fact, everything that is within me, I impart to you. And now is a good time to begin to practice what we're all preaching, right? It's cool that you've seen me raise the dead. Now it's time for you. It's cool that you've seen me heal somebody, but now it's time for you. And you have seen me speak words of life that begin healing and restoring other people. But now it's time for you. And so all of that delegated authority came through being battle-born and weathering the storm. Think about this for a moment. I don't know much about the military or the armed services, but I know that you have to go through strict training and you have to graduate, okay? And I know and I believe this in my heart that the reason why you have to meet a standard and you have to graduate is for you to understand that to stand in the place of confidence and authority inside of that position. Okay? If they started handing out positions and authority for people who weren't battle-born, who couldn't even pass the simplest test, who couldn't do anything, you have a lot of weak-willed, a lot of people with no spine, no backbone inside of these positions. And so they're meant to go through this hardship, right? Go through this pain where many people back out and fall out and not many people make it, so they can understand at the end that they were the ones who had weathered the storm and have gone through it. And so the same is true for his disciples that day. Like, they left the masses on the shore. Those masses weren't involved in weathering the storm. They weren't involved in the strict discipleship that Jesus was teaching them and communicating them. They weren't part of this, okay? And so it's to understand that the deeper reality of discipleship is going through these different situations to come to the other side. So that being said is this. David only became a king through going through Goliath. Okay? Now, I firmly believe that there's no King David without Goliath. It was the manifestation of God's power and willing to be used to take down an enemy that everybody was scared of that gave him the clout and the authority of a man who is after the heart of God, and that he's connected to God, and he's not going to let fear govern his life, and he's going to trust in the Spirit of God. It's that very darkness of that situation that established who he was and his reputation inside of God. Imagine this for a moment. David comes up to Goliath and he begins to see the storm, and he begins to get fearful, and he begins to shake in his boots, and he begins to piss himself. Would we still be talking about him to this day? We absolutely wouldn't. The only thing that would be talking about him is a good example and a good lesson of a fearful man of whom we should not follow. But as we know, he didn't piss his pants that day. In fact, I think he already had a visual plan going on inside of his head that was probably inspired by God. Is that, you know what, if I face somebody who's bigger than, badder than me, I'm going to take my slingshot, fling a rock at their head, knock them down and cut off their head. That's what I'm going to do. And so he shows up that day, not governed by fear. He begins to exercise faith. This is the person who defies the armies of Israel. This is the guy that allowed all of us to shake in fear. Boom. Rock to the head, drop to the head, sword, cut off his head. Problem solved, right? And that's what catapulted David into his future, was facing that dark moment. And so it is this hero's journey. What I talked about the last video, that this life is not about an event. It is about a journey. And that inside of this hero's journey, there's suffering. There is darkness and there's pain. We look inside of the life of Jesus and what he accomplished and the great things that he did. And there he is in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, you know what, if it all possible, let this cup be passed from me. Because he sees the suffering, he sees the pain that he must endure to bring life to others. Okay? And in this place of this journey is dark moments where we begin to suffer. You see, for anything to happen inside of the life of Jesus, it required the suffering, the burial, the death, right? And for any resurrection to take place, it required those things. But what begins to happen in our mindset is that we want the rise without the death. Not understanding that the pain, the suffering, and the death is what is required to manifest a new life. In fact, the Bible says that we must die with him. Okay? To be resurrected into this new life, we must die with him. In fact, it says if we want to reign with him, that we must suffer with him. Okay? And so all of this, a process of life and reigning, is through death and suffering. And this is not the message that we're receiving in the world today. The name it and claim it, the blab it and grab it. Despite popular opinion, God is not so much concerned about your prosperity. He is concerned about the prosperity of your soul and that beginning to manifest in every other area of your life. But in no way does he say, come follow me and I'll give you a life on easy street. That is not the message. But that is the message that we think will come to God and he'll fix everything. I'll come to God and he will take care of all my problems. And the reality is that for this resurrection, for this reigning to take place, it comes to the death of ourselves. It comes to the end of our desires that are contrary to the desires of God. And when those desires begin to fall off and we begin to experience those extinction and we begin to bury the old man and we see that as a reality taking place, then the resurrection of the new life begins to be a reality. But it's all in facing this darkness. This is the last thought I want to give on regards to this, is that Lazarus, we know that Jesus raised him from the dead. Okay. And he died. And he was wrapped up. And he experienced death. Only to come in contact with Jesus and to experience a resurrection. Okay? But the miracle would never have happened if Lazarus didn't die. And what we got to understand is that the dark moments, the darkness, the storms, and all these different things that take place in our life, the rise will never take place without the decline. That is, the shooting of the rocket to the moon will never come without the resistance and the thrust pushing downwards. And so we feel this weight, we feel this pressure, we feel like something's pushing on us, and there are things that are weighted upon us that are pulling us down. Not understanding that that is the motivation and that is the force that causes us to propel and to rise. Embrace it. Embrace the darkness. It's all part of the journey. Think about this. Everybody around Lazarus that day got a lesson because of Lazarus' death. Like nobody would have known and understood that Jesus was the resurrection and the life without Lazarus dying. And it was that pain and it was that dark moment that taught the greatest lesson that could be taught that day. And it came through the storm, the darkness that took place inside of humanity. And it's the truth and it's the reality. All right, brothers, I'll see you on